Thomas King, welcome to the IPA 2019 Annual Forum Podcast Series.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So, Thomas, you've just come out, you've electrified the room. Tell us a bit about really your passion for social enterprise and how this started from such a young age.
Yeah, so I started as a very passionate and extremely naive 13-year-old advocate in the environment space when I learned about an issue happening in Southeast Asia around deforestation. Launched this site to try and educate consumers and food manufacturers about this problem, and it picked off and went global and got a whole bunch of attention, and that propelled me on a journey of working with a number of different organisations across environment, poverty alleviation and so on, to drive forward initiatives to create positive change. And I have ended up in the food technology space after essentially realising that our food system, our agricultural systems are facing some pretty enormous challenges and are at the centre of a lot of the problems that I was trying to solve. But I can tell you more about that.
And listening to your speech, I found it fascinating, really, that the journey that you've been on. I mean, being to, I think it was 5 different countries by the time you were 20. And
5 continents.
The continents, that's right. So really, it's how do we better enable young people like yourself to come up with these entrepreneurial ideas, I suppose, from a public sector perspective? How can we really support that?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, just to set the scene, I'm a regular young Aussie. I grew up in the outer eastern suburbs of Melbourne, you know, with my mum, my dad and my brother. I waited tables at the local cafe. I played tennis at the club down the street. There's nothing particularly extraordinary about me. I've never studied at university. And so for me, it was a matter of thinking critically, asking questions. And the first question I asked was, is this right, when I learned about that issue happening in Southeast Asia? And only from that place of critical thinking can we challenge those inherited beliefs and systems that are often perpetuated and don't necessarily serve any of us. And there's a myriad examples of that. And so I think encouraging young people to think critically about the world and their place within it. I think the importance of focusing the impact you want to have towards the kind of world you want to create is important. You know, I spoke about in my presentation the fact that we don't get to choose whether we have an impact every day. The only choice we have is what kind of impact we create. Everything we buy, everything we eat, every decision we make at work has a ripple effect out into society. So the choice isn't whether that occurs, the choice is what you want that to result in.
So coming from that very normal background, as you said, you had to establish all of those contacts yourself. I imagine that must have been quite daunting in many ways. Are there any things that you can see that perhaps would make that easier or improve that for other young people coming up as you have?
Oh gosh, I mean, there are so many ways. I think that there's enormous space for progress within our education system and our curriculum. I think that the way that we teach and in many respects the content that we teach isn't necessarily equipping young people with the kinds of tools that they need to enter the world that we're heading into. You know, young people today are expected to have 17 jobs in 5 different fields over their lifetime. You know, that's a very different life to the one that previous generations have led. And so the importance of being able to build and cultivate those quote-unquote soft skills, you know, transferable skills, communication, problem solving, interpersonal skills, critical thinking, I think is fundamental because we need to be adaptive in today's world. And by, you know, still imposing this sort of outdated cultural narrative onto young people that says you should just, you know, work hard, get good grades, get a good job, climb the ladder, earn more money, get a mortgage, start a family, send the kids on the same route. I think we should be encouraging young people to think about what they're good at and what they love doing and what the world needs. Because if you can find something that's at the nexus of those 3 things, you know, the financial income, the stability will follow because you're adding value to society.
You mentioned empathy was a really crucial part of your ethic as well. How do we nurture that or in our young people, and not just young people, in everyone? Is that a really crucial part of improving these connections?
Absolutely. I mean, what we're seeing around the world is this increasing division and polarization in particularly democratic developed nations. And I think a big part of that is not listening to one another. We talk before we listen. And I think coming back to our common shared humanity and realizing that we have far more in common than we do than what divides us is critical as a starting point to then progress with those interactions and those decisions. And we need to come back to that. And it can be easy to impose labels on people and see them through that lens. But that's dangerous. We need to come back to recognizing that there's far more that actually unites us. And I shared a couple of stories, about experiences I've had that really reminded me of the importance of empathy, whether it be, being on a crowded train on my way to a project in the Arctic, traveling across Europe and being really pissed off at the fact that I didn't get a seat, and realizing that people surrounding me were Syrian refugees who'd fled their home country out of fear, and I got to know some of them, through to speaking at an all-boys juvenile prison back here in Australia, and being quite terrified, to be honest, and unsure about how they would respond, only to have all of the boys come up afterwards and individually shake my hand, and some of them tell me how inspired they were, and it just reminded me of the fact that we don't choose what start we have in life. And so I think, coming back to that.
And it struck me, part of that was about dealing with the individual people, like putting faces to these big problems of Syrian refugees or youth crime or whatever it is, that by relating to people on that individual level, that helps that empathy.
Yeah, I mean, on the surface it can seem a bit sort of airy-fairy kumbaya, but honestly, it will result in a more coherent and constructive society if we're able to sit down with one another and actually listen and understand where each other are coming from, our beliefs, our concerns, our pains, our hopes, our desires, to then move forward with that, as opposed to making assumptions, making judgments, imposing our own, sometimes inherited beliefs onto groups of people, which isn't helpful for anyone.
And so are you excited that IPA is looking at improving those partnerships
Very
in the
excited.
community?
I've been extremely encouraged by what I've seen and heard, and even prior to arriving here today, learning about IPA and learning about the convention, what a great position they're in to be able to stimulate this kind of thinking and conversation and dialogue around some really, really important topics amongst a group of influential stakeholders in our society.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights again with us, Thomas. But is there anything else that you'd like to add that perhaps I haven't asked?
Well, in case people are wondering what I've ended up doing, I run an organisation now called Food Frontier in the alternative protein space. We're Australia's independent think tank and industry accelerator for plant and cell-based proteins. We've got a 70% increase in food demand within the next 30 years globally, and already major constraints around resources, increasingly volatile climate, more mouths to feed, and particularly an increased demand for meat, for protein. And so the need for alternatives in that mix is really important. And so the work that we do at Food Frontier is helping stakeholders from new innovators through to existing food and even meat manufacturers through to governments to understand the emergence of these alternatives and how they can engage. So if people want to learn more, they can head to foodfrontier.org.
Thank you so much, Thomas.
Thank you.